All right, so I'm going to do a shorter version of the review, just try to hit the main points and address it, how it relates to the head. But in the drawing, what we're doing is we're interpreting a complexity of the world into simple lines. And there's some really simple marks that we use, like a point, and that is helpful to just create a location for something. It doesn't really describe too many things. We can have a line that describes maybe a connection between the points, but you can also think of it as a traveling point. Kind of looks like a comet shooting. It has an energy to it. This is a straight line. Here's a curved line. It also has an energy, not only how it connects the 2 points, but it's also is getting pushed in a certain way in this direction. You can have an organic line that has, a less of a sense of this tension and the speed, and it's just moving in different directions altogether. And the drawing, it becomes the organization of all of these different lines. You can also think about the textures and the shading, but it really is the mark making and how you organize them, how clearly you put them together. It will start to create different illusions. So I can put a couple of lines together, and all of a sudden these lines start to suggest things like, for example, a surface. They kind of end at the same place. They have parallel quality to them. So it starts to look like some kind of a surface. If we have a line turn, that suggests a corner. If we have several changes, it starts to suggest perhaps a shape, and a shape, we can create a sense of a form with the shape if we add another shape that also has a particular relationships, these parallel qualities of some of these lines. These are parallel to each other, these are parallel to each other, and they start to feel like a series of flat planes, what we call surfaces that are planes. And really, we don't have the form in here, but we're creating an illusion of the form. So getting the relationship between the elements accurately is very important. I can then suggest a series of these planes that come together, and we can understand what this is, right? That's a cube. It's a very poorly drawn cube. But we still can kind of see a form of a cube in there. The problem with this cube is that it doesn't relate to the way that we observe things work visually in space. It doesn't work with the perspective. There's no perspectival foreshortening. So as artists, we learn about those perspectival foreshortening and we start to apply them. But when we don't think about it too hard, our brain tries to play tricks on us. And the brain wants to think of an object like a cube and make all of the sides of the cube even. If we make this the same length as this the same length as this, it's not going to show that the corners that are farther away get smaller. And therefore, it's going to flatten out. We're not going to see that receding quality. So when we draw a form in space, we want to start thinking about how things move and get smaller as it moves back. So not only we're dealing with parallel lines, but we're also dealing with how the lines get narrower as it moves back. What am I doing? All right, so we want to think about how it's going to go towards the vanishing point. That's going to be somewhere on the horizon line. And even if these vanishing points might not fit into my paper, wherever they go, we need to keep them in mind, the fact that we do want to narrow it down. So at least we want to create a slight narrowing. And the same thing goes for this. So all of these lines, they are relate to each other. All of these lines, they relate to each other also. They narrow down. And if we really think about something in perspective, we would also create a narrowing down of these edges too. So these edges will also get closer and closer towards the vanishing point, and that's a 4-point perspective in there. There's a 3. Now I'm not sure. This is a 2-point perspective, so I assume this is a 3-point perspective. But that's something that we want to consider. These are subtleties that are important to get them right. And I often see that in this geometric perspective still lifes, that there's some understanding of this, but there's still a lot of mistakes that happen where you don't take it all the way through. And it's hard to get it perfectly accurate. All of the drawings are hard to get perfectly accurate. We just need to think about certain rules and double check and adjust and correct things. One way to correct the perspective is to think about the full form all the way through. This is just 3 flat shapes that we're describing. But we can think of it all the way through as a 3-dimensional form if we think of where the back corner is going to be and how it's gonna, all of these lines that we're seeing all the way through relate to the other lines that we draw. How does this line relate to these lines? And where would these lines be? Do they line up with each other? And I might find that I need to move some of the corners and I can get a little bit more of a specific relationship. I made it a little bit too symmetrical, unfortunately. So if I don't like it, I need to adjust it and change it. So in video lectures, there is a little bit more explanation on how to deal with the cubes, but we will deal with the cubes when we draw the model in a little bit more organic way. The model doesn't really look like a box, but we want to think about that quality, the fact that there will be parallel lines. So when we draw a portrait, for example, a head with the neck, it's a much more organic quality, but we will still think about where is the front and where are these major, what we call inner corners. This is definitely a corner of the cube. So are these. These are the corners of the cube as the surface changes direction. So we're going to have the corners of the cube on the face like this, corners on the cheekbone that create a sense of the top of the head, the surface on the top, surface on the side, surface on the front. I have a little model over here. You can see that those kind of qualities in there. The major inner corners. They will be much softer in the actual figure, but they do exist there, and they're the ones that create the structure for the face, for the larger parts of the face that are really important to address and show somehow, right? So the face is much more organic, softer, and the cylinder works better for the head, to describe the head. The cylinder has its own kind of a volumetric logic. So it is straight, just like the cube on the sides, but it becomes much softer and rounder as it wraps around. And the same, just like with the cube, you want to think all the way through as you're working. The top is very easy. You wrap it around, you see how it the front relates to the back. You want to do the same thing on the bottom and here. But you also want to be able to do that at any location on that cylinder. You want to think through, how does the front goes all the way through the back, so we can feel that relationship, right? And want to be able to create a three-dimensional object. Now, with the symmetrical form like this, you can also think about the line of symmetry. And you can see how the right side will mimic the left side. On the face, that line of symmetry that we're going to think about would be more in the front. And we're going to be thinking about how the left side of the face relate to the right side of the face to show that symmetry. So there will be very geometric qualities to it. It's a little different from the cylinder in there. But we do want to think about that all the way through, because then we're thinking not so much two-dimensionally, we're moving into the way of drawing that's more three-dimensional, where we think through the form. And on the face, it will also be important because you can think about how the form wraps around. So you're dealing with that three-dimensional. We're going to address that in there. You want to understand how things connect together, like this neck, for example. How does it fit underneath the skull? How does the neck attaches itself to the rib cage? So we can think of these objects three-dimensionally. Now, the ellipse has perspectival qualities too that we want to make sure that we address. This top ellipse is going to be not the same as the bottom ellipse. Can anyone tell me what the difference would be between the two ellipses?
One would be, the bottom one would be smaller, just a smidgen.
The bottom one will be smaller?
The yes, question mark. Sorry, are you talking about the entire shape of the, like?
Yeah, like this ellipse.
Oh, okay.
How is
No,
it different from this one?
it would be a little bit wider.
This one would be wider, taller.
Or taller, I suppose, yeah.
So I'm trying to take these ellipse extended and making it wider towards the top, narrow at the bottom. Yeah, it's hard to put the visual things into language, but it's important, you know, because we want to develop that vocabulary. So it's important for us to keep trying, no matter how unusual that language is. We don't use it on everyday basis. That's why in school we want to, this is where we are dealing with those kind of concepts. So you got to practice, keep on trying to verbalize these things. But yeah, the bottom would be wider. Why do you think it's wider at the bottom comparing to the top?
Just mostly due to angle, because we see a little bit less of the top.
Mhm. It's getting closer and closer to the horizon.
Yeah.
Things gonna get smaller and flatter, right? So it's important to sense that subtle difference, just like we sensed how things are getting smaller and there's subtle difference between these planes. There will be a subtle difference between the ellipses. If we break that illusion and we draw something narrower again, it's gonna flatten things out. It's not gonna give us that sense of connection between these subtle lines in there. So we will use that sense of three-dimensional way of wrapping things around the forms when we're gonna be dealing with describing face in lines. So we gotta make sure that we get that just right. There's another thing about the ellipse, is that the front of ellipse will be different from the back of the ellipse. One difference is that, you know, I'm drawing all the way through and I'm making the back a little bit lighter, but also that helps me to bring that edge forward. So notice that I try to get a darker contrasting line for the front and lighter lines in the back, and that definitely sets up this sense of depth a little bit. But there is another difference between the front curve of the ellipse and the back curve of the ellipse. Do you know what the difference would be between this edge and this edge? Anyone?
The perspective?
Perspective? But what would be the difference? How else can we describe that? So it's symmetrical, right? But I think if we trace on the plane that this ellipse exists on, and we find that the center line of that ellipse will be a little bit closer to the back, where the back half of the ellipse is going to be narrower than the front part of the ellipse. What you will notice is that the ellipse is going to be slightly flatter in the back and slightly rounder towards the front. And this is a much more exaggerated difference, but you will see that there is a big difference between the top and the bottom if we're drawing it in perspective. So one thing that you want to avoid is doing the opposite, doing it rounder on top and flatter on the bottom. You would only do that if you're looking at it from the bottom, if it's above the horizon line. But if it's below the horizon line, you would do the opposite. Oh, let me get in the camera here. Rounder, more arc on the bottom, less at the top. Make that, I'm gonna make that edge a little bit thicker. Does that make sense? Is that something familiar to you guys or no?
Yeah, it's familiar.
Awesome. So you can practice there's a video that allows us to practice drawing the ellipses. I am pretty bad at it, but when you draw ellipse, sometimes your hand motion makes a one type of flattening on one side, but you go in a different direction, it makes a different type of flattening. So you get to use that to train your hand to describe accurate change in perspective. So if your hand draws a bigger arc when you go from left to right, make it bigger arc on top. You make it when you make ellipses that describe the bottom of the form. But if you need to describe the opposite, you use right to left. But anyways, you want to figure out what your hand does, you know, and try to draw these ellipses as accurately as you can. Try to practice them. And I'm terrible at it. And if you can't draw a perfect ellipse, then you do what I was doing over here. You mark where your sides are. You mark where your proportions would be, where the center line is, and then you can carefully trace it to these lines. So this is a more constructive way of drawing. Now, in our class, we're going to be using more constructive way of drawing, where we mark things with points, and then we connect things with straight lines or straight curves, the curves that are not organic, but rather more of a C curves. There's other ways of drawing, more gestural, sketchy way of drawing, of searching lines, and I'm blanking out on the other type. But anyway, so we're going to be using this a more specific logical way of constructing cylinders and cubes. And for your homework, I'd like you to apply these principles. So make notes on what makes a more accurate cubes and ellipses. By the way, one more thing you want to avoid, which is a very common mistake, is this sharp corners on the ends, or football-like ellipses. The ellipses will always be round on the end. So you can think of them going around these forms. Don't pinch it, and you're going to get a better quality ellipse.